what I should point out from the start really is that there are various aspects of this that I do sort of full hour-long talks on in their own right, so I've condensed it considerably. But what I did want to say, that's my wonderful wife disappearing there, is just going to set me up. What I did want to say is that there is the vast majority of what you're going to hear tonight is covered in far more detail in my doctoral thesis, and you can visit that, you can download that free of charge online. Westfield War Memorial Village, Disability, Paternalism and Philanthropy, 1915 to 2015. So if there's any sort of thing that really grabs you and you think, I want to know more about that specific topic, then you can get that for free there. So let's start. Before I talk about the disabled of the First World War, I wanted to provide some context. And as you can see, I'm going to put up a picture of Queen Elizabeth I. That's because it's thought actually that Queen Elizabeth I was the first sort of head of state to put a form of basic provision in place for disabled veterans. And she put this onto the statute books in 1593. And so she informed the Privy Council at this time that they were permitted to provide funding for disabled veterans who reside in arms rooms in cathedrals or collegiate houses. So it's not a statutory, that's important, and I'm going to keep coming back to that. It's not a statutory provision, but you know, they can, if they are approached to do so and they think that it's a worthy cause, they can have funding to provide some sort of for disabled fighters. So the culmination of this early approach was the creation of some bespoke institutions in the 17th century, such as the Chelsea and Greenwich hospitals. But of course, as you would expect, that's, you know, they're just two quite small facilities really. Places were limited, and indeed, even if you managed to get in while you were okay, it was very much about you. So if you were a married man with spouses and dependents, you might have escaped the workhouse, but they wouldn't have. The game changer really in all of this is the Boer War. So this is the first sort of war where there is mass media coverage of it. You know, there are war correspondents embedded, as we would now say, with the military forces, and there's much more media coverage in, you know, the newspapers each day are carrying reports of where things are. There's little maps that you can pin to your wall so you can follow, you know, the movements of what's going on. And of course, the public engage with this conflict in a much more immersive way. So they have more of an emotional investment in it as well. And so as a result of that, at the end of the Boer War, the fundraising, the public donations for the disabled of that war is huge. The equivalent of, it's estimated, of about £400 million in today's money. And of course, that puts pressure on the regiments of the line as well, the infantry battalions, who have also got to be seen to be sort of responding to this new level of public sort of interest in the care of their service personnel. So they start creating some cottage hospitals and almshouses of their own. So we've now moved, courtesy of the Boer War, into a new realm of public involvement and public concern for the disabled of war, which of course has an impact on politicians as well. So by the time we get to the First World War, there is a basic level of provision of pension for disabled service personnel. Now, in 1914, a man suffering from 100% disability, which means that, you know, he's incapable of providing for himself at all, would receive only 17 shillings and sixpence a week. And I say the word only because you have to look at that again in context. So the average weekly food bill at that time of a working class family was 23 shillings and 9 pence. So there's a 6 shilling shortfall there. And don't forget, this is only about food bill, not taking into account rent or any other sort of bills or commitments that may be accrued. So it's basically inadequate. But the government's wise. We're in a war where very early on it becomes clear that there are going to be huge numbers of casualties. Indeed, by 1915, after the initial sort of rush of enthusiasm, to enlist, by very early in 1915, the number of people volunteering dropped radically. And this is going to result, obviously, in conscription in Britain for the first time, and it's going to come into place in 1916. The politicians are aware that there is, they're on very dangerous ground if they're going to bring in conscription, force civilians, unwilling civilians to fight, and not provide a better form of sort of aftercare for them if they're going to be injured in the process of doing so. So in 1916, we get the Naval and War Pensions Bill, which is basically sort of about the state sort of saying, here's more money, but we're still going to keep it at arm's length. So they're pushing money out to locally controlled committees like the National Relief Fund. The problem with these sort of committees is that they're run by volunteers. And of course, in the Edwardian period, just like the Victorian period before, those kind of committees tend to be run by people from a certain sort of sphere of, the social sphere. So we're talking about people from, middle class, upper middle class sorts of backgrounds who are running these committees. And they're very paternalistic, they're very moralistic as well, and they're very subjective about who they're going to give the money to. So if you turn up, they've got the power to say to you, actually, I see that when you arrived here, you were smoking. Well, I'm not going to give you extra money because, I don't think smoking's a good thing. Or, oh, hang on, don't I know you? You've got a reputation for drink. No, I'm not giving you any money. So it really was that subjective. It was on the hands of a sort of very small group of people who were controlling who was going to get the money. So the first move towards a centralized form of control and commitment came in the spring of 1917. This results from Lloyd George creating a coalition government. And in order to form a coalition to get the majority he needed, he had to bring the Labour Party on board. And one of the Labour Party's big conditions of being part of his coalition was that he would create a Ministry of Pensions, a centralised state form of care for disabled servicemen. And of course, he agrees to this. But it is a reluctant commitment. And in fairness, you can see why, because that figure that you can see there, 1.7 million, is the estimated number of British service personnel who come back from the First World War with some form of disability. Now that goes from people who might have got an injury or a condition that may actually be treatable in the short to medium term. It might not be something that's going to affect them for life. So it goes from treatable cases right through to people who have got 100% disability who are never going to work again. But as you can see, it's a huge figure. And the politicians are not so keen to sort of make massive commitments to such a large body because, they could well be staring sort of political bankruptcy in the face. But by the same token, they don't want to be seen to be sort of, letting down the people who fought for them. So they're trying to play this sort of clever game, really, which puts them at odds with some of the leading lights who are in their own sort of, think tanks, as we would now call them. That's a picture of John Galsworthy, who was the chief advisor to the Ministry of Pensions in 1918. And Galsworthy himself was very much at odds with the politicians on this. Well, I'll read you a little bit of one of his most famous sort of treatises was called The Sacred Work. And essentially what he's saying is that, look, you can't just put a sort of quick plaster on this, give someone a prosthetic limb or something, teach them how to weave a basket and send them out back into civilian life and say, there you go, just get on with it now. It's got to be far more far-reaching than that. And this is what a section of the sacred work. He says, the sacred work is not departmental. It is one long organic process. From the moment a man is picked up on the field of battle to the moment he is restored to the ranks of full civilian life. Our eyes must not be fixed merely on the stressful present, but on the world that this man will be living in 10 years hence. To carry the process of restoration to a point short of this is like leaving a cathedral without a spire. And he's saying, look, if you are going to do the right thing by these men who fought and suffered for their country, you've got to look at the long term. You've got to deliver on housing. You've got to deliver on retraining the men who can't return to the work that they were doing before because of the nature of the disability they've got. And you've got to train them for meaningful employment. And also there has to be an ongoing commitment to long-term medical care, because even someone, for example, who now is young and can get about, if they're an lower limb amputee, they might be able to get about on crutches at this point. But as they get older, then they're not going to be able to do that. So therefore, they're going to need other support. They're going to need other aids. And so this is the idea of the sacred work. Not always popular because, again, politicians, understandably to a degree, are not keen to commit themselves to such far-reaching expenditure. So let's have a look at how this feeds through in the immediate sort of post-war years. Let's look at the idea of jobs. So, Britain's disabled veterans, unlike, actually, it's worth noting, most of the other nations who took part in the Great War, the disabled veterans of Britain were assessed for their military disability pensions on their levels of physical disfigurement or illness, with no account taken of their ability to work or pay for the upkeep of themselves or their dependents. Now, I'll give you an example of this. This is an example from the Westfield settlement in Lancaster, which we'll talk about shortly. And you've got two properties. In one property is a veteran young chap who was a professional footballer for Bolton Wanderers at the outbreak of the war. He loses a leg. In the property next to him is another chap who's older than him, who's also lost a leg. But that chap was employed by the post office in an administrative capacity prior to the war. And when the war finished, he was able to pick up where he left off, to take his war pension and go back to the post office and earn the same income that he was earning before the war, and he can provide for his family. So there is no sort of consideration being given in terms of the pension delivery on British shores as to the ability of a specific individual, his specific circumstances. It's one sort of catch-all system. Now, you might have thought the trade unions would, have had something to say about all of this and come to the support of disabled servicemen. But in actual fact, quite the opposite, because the trade unions were very opposed to the idea of an open door of employers letting disabled men back into the workplace. because they feared, because they were in receipt of a pension, that they would accept lower wages as a supplement to their pension, and therefore sort of drive down the whole wages system, which would affect able-bodied men as well who didn't have a pension. So the trade unions were not actually supportive at all on the whole of helping disabled servicemen back into the workplace. The government ignored intensive lobbying from the likes of the British Legion for a law to force employers to hire disabled men, which did in fact a version of that kind of principle, a more statutory approach was taken after the Second World War. But the First World War, they refused to put anything statutory on employers. And instead, they set up a scheme called the King's National Roll, which was a voluntary scheme that was encouraging larger employers to make 5% of their workforce disabled former service personnel. We don't have complete records of the King's National Roll. But as you could expect, of course, you know, the very few companies actually sort of met that full sort of criteria. So such has been argued that, you know, huge swathes of disabled servicemen were literally kept out of the post-war labour market. Sadly, the sort of picture that you're seeing there of the servicemen sort of begging on the street was only too common in the 1920s and 1930s. So that's the employment situation. So what about homes? Well, of course, Lloyd George had put improved housing for veterans at the heart of the political agenda in 1917 with his pledge to build 200,000 new homes fit for heroes. In practice, the 1919 Housing and Town Planning Act, the Addison Act, as it was known, resulted in roughly 170,000 new dwellings being built. But cuts to the programme and the money that was being put in, which affected the quality of the housing that could be built, angered Addison himself, who the act was named after, so much that within 2 years he actually resigned and you know, was opposed to having his name involved with it anymore. And indeed, much of the new housing that was built by the local corporations the rents were priced at a level that was beyond the reach of the disabled servicemen on pensions that they were receiving. So once again, disabled service personnel found themselves really kind of pushed to the outside. I did a study to try and find if any local corporations put any kind of specific provision in place for disabled service personnel. There was some supportive work done in Nottingham, but I couldn't find anything similar anywhere else. So again, the men, when it comes to housing, as in the employment market, find themselves pushed to the margins. So what's going to save the day? What's going to help these men and their dependents? Well, the answer is the same thing that sadly has always been the saviour of not just disabled service personnel, but indeed to a large degree the disabled community, full stop. And that is charity and philanthropy. And it's not going to be any different after the end of the First World War. And this is both on small and large scale sort of charitable giving. So, I mean, I won't go into great detail about this now, there's not the time to do so, but I mean, one of the big sort of legacies of the First World War is that it absolutely changes charity in the modern age, because there is a huge growth in charities during the First World War. In Britain alone, the number of charities is thought to have doubled. And that meant that sort of the competition to raise money became, you know, much more sort of intense. So it led to greater sort of professionalism of the charitable process. Before the Armistice in 1918, there were 6,000 charities dedicated to trying to help disabled servicemen in Britain alone. So charity is there. The problem with it is these are all little piecemeal organisations looking at certain sorts of aspects of problems, quite often at a parochial level. And what's, of course, really needed is something far further reaching than that. And this is where the story moves on to a different level. I don't know how well you can see the pictures on the screen, but there are two key figures here. There's a chap with a very impressive hat. I'm going to move my mouse over it. I don't know if that helps you. He's called Thomas H. Mawson, and he's a leading landscape designer and architect who, both on a national and an international scale. And in fact, he does tours of Canada, of North America, of the United States as well. He's a very well-known and respected figure. He lives in Lancashire. And the chap next to him with the moustache and the impressive tunic, which is the tunic of the High Sheriff of Lancashire, is Herbert Lushington Story, who's from a very, very wealthy industrial family and very philanthropic as well. And they're also pro-militarists. And Mawson had designed the gardens at Lushington Story's home. They know each other, part of a social elite network in that part of the world. And they are going to try and do something that hasn't been done before. They are going to try and create a nationwide network of communities for disabled servicemen of the First World War and their families. Their motivation for doing so is quite different. On the side, the figure that you can see in full profile, is Herbert Lushington Story's son Kenneth, who was a cavalryman in the First World War and survived the conflict. And Herbert, moving my mouse around him again in the hope that you might be able to see that, the guy with the epaulets and impressive tunic, in thanks for the fact that his son has come home safe, and also sort of as a sense of duty that, you know, he was very active in encouraging people to enlist to fight, and now he's going to do his bit, you know, to ensure that those who did fight are treated well afterwards. So he's motivated as sort of as a gift of thanks in relation to his son and a sense of duty, whereas Mawson, the man in the big fedora, is motivated as an act of commemoration, because the chap down at the bottom here is his youngest son, James Radcliffe Mawson, who was amongst that sort of body of young men who at the start of the war had rushed to volunteer. He enlisted with the 5th Battalion of the King's Own Royal Lancaster Regiment, which was based in his hometown. 5th Battalion were territorials. A Powell's battalion before the name of Powell's sort of was really taken on. You know, these local territorial units were all very parochial and all sort of knew each other very well. And James Radcliffe Mawson's is the 5th Battalion, is sent out to the Western Front in 1915. They're initially billeted behind the lines near Breedside, near a field hospital. And James Radcliffe writes a letter home to his parents saying, "Oh, you want to see these men at this hospital, the wounded men, their bravery, their attitude is just incredible. If you can do anything to help the injured of this war, you must do so." And then the next communique that arrives at the Mawson household back in Lancashire is to say that James has been killed in the Second Battle of Ypres. The first time he's actually been into action, sort of rushed into the lines after the first German gas attack on the Western Front. And he's killed. For those of you who are interested in these kind of things, I know a lot of people who are watching this might go out to the battlefield. He's buried in China Wall Cemetery. So, Mawson Senior now thinks, he turns to the last letter that he got home from his son, talking about the wounded men and how he must do anything he can to help them. And he takes this now as a sort of personal crusade that he's going to do what his son asked him to do in his last letter. So he enlists the support of a number of very wealthy philanthropists and leading philanthropists. And he achieves that by writing a book. Don't forget, he's a town planner, he's a landscape architect. So this is how he thinks, this is what I can do. I can, do something worthwhile for the disabled of the war. I can create a blueprint for factory settlements. Now, for those, I know there are people watching this from outside of Britain, but for those who are in Britain, the sort of the template to a degree for this is the 19th century sort of factory settlements. That some of them are still are there, and Saltaire in Yorkshire, and Port Sunlight on Merseyside on the Wirral, Bourneville factory in the Midlands. Big sort of communities that paternalistic sort of factory owners have created, where you've got a complete community with a big industrial focal point where you can go, and most people in this sort of built community are going to be employed there. Some of them will be employed in sort of subsidiary industries that support that, from running shops, teachers on schools, there'll be churches, there'll be all the facilities you would expect. There'll be better quality housing than the working classes would usually expect. And there'll be sort of better quality surroundings and facilities, bowling greens, lovely sort of landscape gardens, etc. So Mawson takes that principle, that concept, and this is what he's going to do. He's going to create a nationwide series of model industrial settlements that will be inhabited by disabled servicemen of the First World War and their dependents. And his book, An Imperial Obligation, gets huge support from across the sort of the political divide, and from the great and good across the whole of Britain. And indeed, there's huge interest abroad as well. He goes and does talks about it as in North America. And he attracts enough support to get some of the leading philanthropists and social reformers of the age on a committee called Industrial Settlements Incorporated. And this includes figures like Walter Rowntree, the Rowntree's family, Gordon Selfridge, the big sort of department store owner, the previously mentioned Herbert Lushington Story from Lancashire, Lord Avesbury, William Hill, the big housing reformer, George Reeves Smith owns the Savoy Hotel chain. Very wealthy and very well-respected figures all come on board to try and make this happen. But they still are dependent on government support to build these. What they're going to do is set up a sort of a national umbrella organisation that will help with good practice and running and setting up and advice on how to run the industries, etc. They still need the government to put in the initial injections of cash to make this happen. And of course, it'll come as no surprise here that the government isn't so keen to take on this kind of a commitment. Indeed, to the point where Thomas himself says that they reach a point really in sort of 1917 into 1918 where they're getting what he describes, and I'll quote him here, the same unvarying attitude of hostility from representatives of the Ministry of Pensions. And this becomes so crushing to them that they are forced to sort of scrap their ambitions and downsize them. And so Industrial Settlements Incorporated splits into two. a southern wing and a northern wing. And the southern wing focused their attention under the auspices of Sir George Reeve Smith, the Savoy Hotel owner, who incidentally is also acting out of memoriam because he's lost a son in the war. And he sets up a settlement at Preston Hall in Kent. And Mawson retreats back to Lancashire with Herbert Lushington Story, who's already pledged his own father's family estate at Westfield on the edge of Lancaster city centre with 15 acres of land for a settlement to be built there. And this is what they do, they split. So sadly, the concept of sort of a nationwide provision has already now gone, and they're going to have to rely on parochial support. And this is what they do. So this is an advert for the War Memorial Village, Westfield, Lancashire. And as you can see in the adverts, they're asking for £500 to build a property on this settlement. £70 will provide a cubicle, like a sort of bed sit within the existing family property on the community, which they're going to turn into sort of the old servants' quarters into bed sits for disabled men who are single. The houses are going to be for married men who've got dependents. Then had to give up on the idea of creating a big factory, and associated railway lines coming on, etc. They're going to instead sort of downsize the retraining system from the old stable blocks into workshops where men can be retrained in things, jobs like tailoring and pipe making, watch repairs, this kind of work that they can do in their own homes if their disability is such that they can't go out to the workplace. Now the problem is, and I'm in the process of the Western Front Association members, I'm in the process of writing an article at the moment for a future bulletin about the controversy of commemoration, because it was actually a very fraught and contentious issue. And particularly sort of the idea of utilitarian memorials like Westfield that weren't, memorials in the conventional sense where they were a memorial to the fallen. They were actually sort of practical memorials that, it was like honour the dead by sort of honouring the living, which a lot of people sort of, thought was a great idea, but others were not keen on at all. And in the case of Lancaster, you've got the Westfield War Memorial Village, and then you've got the local corporation, which are not keen on having a village for living people as a village to mark the remembrance of the dead. And so they set up their own sort of fundraising campaign for a memorial to the dead. So you've now got two big sort of fundraising things competing with each other in one city. What the Westfield Committee do is they sort of dig into their elite people, the wealthy people. They dig into their own little black books and start literally, and you could say quite cynically to some degree, approaching wealthy people in their district who've lost a husband or a son and saying to them, how about giving us £500 for a property? And indeed, what you see there is a picture of the first two cottages that were built that were both paid for by a wealthy industrialist called Joseph Bibby, who lost two of his sons on the battlefield of the Western Front and had a third son came home disabled. And he got a knock on his door and said, how do you fancy paying for a couple of cottages to pay, in memory of your two sons who died? And of course, Julie hands over £1,000 for that to happen. You've got a really unusual situation here on Westfield. Not only is the whole community war memorial, so in effect becomes every property, because certainly the first phase of building work on the village, all of the properties are paid for in memory of an individual. There's a couple of the plaques that were attached to them in honour of that fact. So one of them here says, in proud and loving memory of William Edward Roper, Captain, 5th Battalion, the King's Own Royal Lancaster Regiment, who fell in action at Wiltshire, Belgium, on July the 31st, 1917, the Battle of Ypres, aged 23 years. This cottage was given by his mother and sister, so they paid the £500. Below that inset is another one, erected by the depot of the King's Own Royal Regiment, in memory of all those of the regiment who gave their lives for king and country. In actual fact, there would be 8 properties built on the village, on the Westfield settlement, with direct links to King's Own, and specific battalions paid for properties in memory of the men of their own battalions who fell. The problem was, once they'd used up their little black books, where did they go from there? And I'm going to address this very briefly again, because this story is quite a unique one, and it's told in much more detail. There's a video on the Western Front Association website called Picking Up the Pieces After the First World War, about the women of Westfield and the role that they played in that. You can go to the Western Front Association website and find that. But one of the key figures in this is Hilda Lale, who you see pictured there, who a suffragist who during the war gave up her political activism, took part in an acting troupe going into care homes for disabled service personnel, got a real empathy for the disabled and injured of the war. And then after the war was over, thought, I've got to do something to help them. So she set off up a one-off golden ballot, which was effectively like a national lottery. And the money from that golden ballot went to the Roehampton Hospital, which was very involved in the retraining and rehabilitation of disabled servicemen, and to the southern branch of the industrial settlements community at Preston Hall in Kent. Now, Herbert Lushington's story obviously saw this and approached and said, look, I know that was meant to be a one-off. How about doing a second golden ballot and making Westfield the beneficiary of it? And she did so. And the amount of money that was raised then sort of trebled the size of the Westfield community. For her contribution in doing that, she was duly arrested and charged under the Betting and Gaming Act for running an illegal lottery. She opted for trial by jury, won, and as a result of that, the nature of fundraising in this country was changed forever. But as I say, you can find more about that on the Western Front Association website, the video. So by 1924, they're in a position to formally unveil Westfield. The first residents had moved on before then. And that's a picture of the bowling green. And in the middle of it is Earl Haig, former commander-in-chief of the British forces, who opened the community. There's an inset picture down here with Haig. The chap in the top hat is Lord Derby. Who came up with the idea of service battalions, or PALS battalions, as many of them became known as. And that's the mayor of Lancaster, Alderman Briggs, who was also the chairman of the Westfield Committee. Like lots of the Westfield Committee, had a lot of empathy with the project. He too had a son who had come home from the First World War with disabilities. Okay, so I'm going to sort of push through this last phase of the talk. This is an important aspect because there's a lot of criticism about the settlements that were built, because Mawson wasn't on his own with this idea of creating settlements. Other settlements were created. What happened was they ceased, they didn't become part of a national movement. They all became created by sort of individual philanthropists, and a bit more detail on that in a minute. They were criticised quite often for their approach to this, because it was a case of, he who pays the piper, calls the tune. So, for example, there was a big settlement created by Sir Oswald Stoll, variety theatre owner, who created the War Seal Mansions in Chelsea in London. And, one of the kind of quirks of, if you wanted to live on his settlement, and he did have an industry attached to it, so you got a job as well as a property, but he was sort of horrified by the new ideology that was kind of grown out of the First World War, which was communism. So if you wanted to live on his settlement and work in his factory, if you were caught out sort of trying to get any kind of collectivism going or trade unionism, you were out straight away, and so too were your family. Likewise, another settlement was created by Fortescue Fox in Enham in Hampshire, and he was a Quaker. So, and he was very committed to the idea of getting people back to a simpler way of living, and so he created these sorts of agricultural. But he's a Quaker, so if you're going to live on his settlement, he's not going to let you drink alcohol, and it's lights out at 10 o'clock at night. So there's compromises to actually sort of the many benefits that you accrue from living on these kind of settlements: better housing, work, etc., peppercorn, rent. The quid pro quo for that is that you have to sort of adhere to whatever the quirks are of the person who's paid for it and what his motivation. But what in the criticisms of that, what is often overlooked is just how pioneering these people were. So let's have a look who they were building for. These are four residents here of the initial residents of the Westfield settlement. And here we've got a chap called Herbert Billington. Herbert was virtually shorn in half by a German shell in France in 1917. So he lost his right arm, his right buttock, his right leg. The Germans are advancing. His comrades just leave him for dead. The Germans come across him and they don't leave him for dead. They pick him up off the battlefield, put him back through their medical system, operate on him extensively, save his life, repatriate him almost immediately because they know he's not going to be a combatant again. And, he not only sort of survives the conflict, but actually goes on to father a number of children as well, while living on the Westfield settlement. And interestingly, as you will hear, quite a lot of the Westfield residents would not hear a bad word said about the Germans because of that. But, as far as he was concerned, his comrades had left him dead. The Germans picked him up, saved his life, and sent him home again. The chap in the wheelchair, you can see how cumbersome the early wheelchairs are, is Mr. Lancaster. He was a double lower limb amputee. He's, he's not going to be working, and he's very severely affected. Below him here is one of his immediate neighbours, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor's also a lower limb amputee, but he's got severe shell shock mental problems as well. To the point that I spoke to his daughter a few years ago, and she said that growing up with him was terrible. It was so sad. I mean, he could literally, in her words, be lost for hours, for days, just sat in a chair, staring into space, continually being put in and out of the local asylum. But when he wasn't, he'd been retrained. He's called Mr. Taylor. He'd fittingly been retrained as a tailor on the Westfield estate and worked as a tailor when he wasn't when he was able to do so. And the other chap here to the side of him is Bradshaw on the bottom, rather sad-looking chap with the jacket and the tie on. And he was shot through the eye by on the battlefield. The bullet goes through his eye, out of the back of his brain, or the back of his skull, misses his brain, I should say. And again, he's another one who's picked up on the battlefield by the Germans, put through their medical system, and repatriated at the end of the war. And quite indebted to the Germans as a result. There you get a bit of a kind of idea of the different types of people that were at the early residents of Westfield, and similarly in some of these other settlements. So what was built for them? Well, let's quickly look at the aforementioned community at Chelsea, Sir Oswald Stoll's facility at Chelsea. Unlike Mawson, as we'll see in a minute, he's a practical man, a very, very practical man. He's not sort of into this idea like Mawson, who's a landscape designer and member of the sort of Garden City movement. He's builds flats, but what he's building is flats where there's lifts, and the lifts have got wide doors so you can get wheelchairs in, and the flats have got wide doors, and so have the internal rooms. And not only that, he's built things like the kitchen, the cooker, and the cupboards and etc. at a lower level, so that someone who might, if they are in a wheelchair, can access them. Likewise the sink, likewise the bath, all at a lower level, so that in actual fact there's a better chance of someone having independence. And what you've got to bear in mind here is the concept of sort of designing for access for all, for disabled friendly sort of architecture. The first sort of real blueprint for that doesn't come until the 1960s, and it isn't until the 1970s that the British government passes an act that makes it statutory for those kind of considerations to be made. And yet here is a man building a community. Incidentally, this community was built while the war was still going on, who is coming up with these pioneering ideas about access for all, which is an incredible feat. This, by the way, is Fortescue Fox's agricultural settlement at Enham, a different sort of kettle of fish. And as you can see in the early days, it's a male-dominated sort of community, although it does expand to involve families as well. What about Westfield, our settlement that Mawson and Story are building at Lancaster? Well, theirs is a very different approach. They're building a garden city. They're very much into the aesthetics of recovery, because they believe that the idea is that after this hugely industrialized form of warfare, the best thing that they can do for their veterans is to provide them with nature and the healing processes of nature. Big tree-lined avenues, big gardens, and, you know, attractive arts and crafts style housing, the real Unwin Garden City sort of principle. They build some bungalows for men with mobility issues, but there's a big point here. Given the fact that we looked at those residents who were the early residents, you will have noted that, you know, 3 of the 4 that I showed you were lower limb amputees, and they've got big mobility issues. Only 8 of over 100 properties on Westfield were bungalows. The rest of them were 2-story houses. So someone like Herbert Billington, who we saw, who was nearly shorn in half by the German shell, has to live in a property where he can only live in the parlour downstairs because he can't get upstairs. So it's something completely different to what we were seeing in Chelsea, at Stoll's Warseal Mansions, where it's about the practicalities of these men being able to be independent and live in their own home. Whereas what Mawson's obsessed with is the idea of helping them to heal their minds in a more attractive environment. So why have they come to these kind of different approaches? Well, I think what stuck with Mawson, and we're getting to the end of the talk now, I'm going to round it off with this, is the fact that he was very cut to the quick, really. He took it very personally, the government's sort of rejection of his idea of this nationwide movement of settlements. One of the sort of reasons that they gave for not funding it was that this was the war to end all wars. And that if they spent a fortune on all these settlements around Britain, that within one generation, the purpose for them being built would have gone. And of course, Mawson said, well, you know, well, okay, but what's the worst case scenario? You've promised homes, you know, better housing. So, yeah, okay, if that's true, and, you know, after one generation, when these disabled veterans have gone through the system, what we're left with is beautiful, attractive, you know, communities and housing. Well, so what? And I think he built with one eye very much to the long-term future, as opposed to the immediate sort of practical needs of his residents. which, you know, you can see that in two ways. I'm not too comfortable with that myself. I think you should have built a lot more for the immediate needs of the people who were going to live there initially, rather than, you know, a subsequent generation. Mawson died in the 1930s, so he never, you know, got to see what was coming, but clearly it was not the war to end all wars. And indeed, I think one of the saddest aspects of life on these settlements, and Westfield is an example of it, is that, you know, the veterans of the First World War, the disabled veterans who were living on this community, then had to send off their own children to fight in a Second World War. And as you can see from that memorial there, a number of the children of those First World War veterans are subsequently killed on the battlefields. Incidentally, the communities, a lot of these communities grow again after the Second World War in order to accommodate this new influx of disabled veterans from a new war. And on Westfield, exactly the same tactics. You use the little black book opens. There's a picture at the top there, and what you're seeing, a chap called Colonel Porritt, who was an officer, field hospital unit, field ambulance unit in the First World War, very rich philanthropist. And he was asked to pay for some properties in the Second World War extension in memoriam of his son down here, who's inside at the bottom, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Porritt, who was a member of Parliament, the first member of Parliament to be killed in the Second World War on the retreat to Dunkirk. So again, the same tactics are being used again to fundraise, getting wealthy people to pay for houses. So, how many of these settlements still survive in the present day? Not very many, and indeed, there's only the facility in Chelsea, Stoll's facility, and Westfield that kind of was set up as those kind of settlements that still really kind of fulfill the same role that they did when they were originally set up as a result of the First World War. There are still obviously housing clusters that people like Haig homes have set up, etc. But on the whole, really, the larger sort of settlements, it is Stoll's facility and Westfield that survived to the present day, and they've done that during in terms of extreme hardship by selling off land. So as you can see here, Stoll sold off some of their land to Roman Abramovich for an expansion at Chelsea to raise money, and Westfield did the same sort of thing. But they all remain in this present day, as they did at the time of the First World War, completely dependent on survival in terms of charitable support, help the heroes, combat stress, British Legion, etc. So, to finish off, in conclusion to all of this, what do we learn from anything from the First World War, the disabled, the outcome of that, and what's changed? Well, the answer is sadly very little. The conclusion is that it's the generosity of the good old British public that has enabled successive British governments of every political hue to continue to allow the care of the disabled of war to primarily remain a charitable rather than a state-funded. And as I say, if you've found this talk interesting, you can access my thesis online, and there is a video on the website. I just wanted to say a very quick thank you as well to the Western Front Association for the work, the incredible work they've done on saving the pension records, because what that has done for people like myself and who've spent years researching disabled servicemen of the First World War is just opened up so many huge avenues of research. So, you know, a big sort of pat on the back for the association in that respect. A good reason for those of you who aren't members who are watching this to seriously perhaps consider supporting the Western Front Association by joining up. I'm open to questions.
Martin, thanks very much indeed. That was a splendid talk. Thoroughly enjoyed that, and many thanks indeed for the plug at the end regarding the pension records and joining the Western Front Association. That's excellent, very, very good of you. Once again, as normal, if people enjoyed that, you'd like to raise your hands. That's splendid. Martin, you can't see this, but there's a hand raising exercise going on, and everybody's busy raising their hands as we speak. So thanks for that. We've got some questions and some questions in already, which is excellent. Now, Malcolm, you're live. Thanks for your question. Can we? You want to ask Martin your question, Malcolm, please?
Yeah, Martin, first and foremost, a very interesting talk. My question, and thank you for your talk, by the way, my question was dealing with prosthetics, as in the title of the talk. Yeah. So it's probably not particularly apt, but I was wondering that the development of prosthetics during the Great War, what sort of influence does it have on today? If it's not your field, I fully understand, because you didn't touch on that subject, but that was my question, and perhaps you can...
Well, I think, it does. This is the thing that Galsworthy was referring to, really, the idea that there is a need for sort of ongoing medical support, and that is very much about prosthetics. And it's substantive. I mean, all these sorts of legacies of the First World War that, we always think about the First World War in terms of military legacies rather than social, medical legacies or charitable legacies. And there is a huge improvement in prosthetics. I mean, we have an early resident on the Westfield settlement, for example, who had a wooden leg, the sort of the traditional concept of the wooden leg. And indeed, there's a lovely anecdotal story of him in the winter one time. He's out in the city in Lancaster, and he falls, and of course the leg sort of to the passing members of the public, there's this leg off at an angle, and someone says, "Oh, phone for an ambulance," and this chap says, "No, phone for a carpenter, get him to bring some nails." And then within a very short space of time, we then see sort of more lightweight forms of prosthetics coming in. So by the time, there's a really interesting, during the Second World War, Westfield was used for evacuees from Salford in Manchester, for lots of young children to be moved away from Salford because it was near sort of the docks and the bombing, and they were housed with a lot of the First World War veterans on Westfield. And there's some lovely stories that they tell. One of them said, she was sleeping in the room where one of the veterans and his wife, and she's laying on a mattress on the floor, looking under the bed at these two prosthetic legs, and very quickly sort of got used to this weird sort of, relationship that she was forced to have. But what's telling about it is that they've changed. They've become a sort of like a durable form of plastic by that time. But what I think, one of the perhaps the more shocking aspects of that is that they all said that they went for regular sort of treatment on their limbs, and they went to the prosthetics workshop. Now, Lancaster is quite a considerable way away from Manchester, and yet the nearest sort of prosthetics workshop that they could access was in Manchester. And so they were having to travel, considerable distances to try and get sort of access, better sort of care for their treatment of their limbs, and to access sort of any improvements that were coming on the line in relation to prosthetics. But it's an ever-changing and evolving process. And I think by the time of the Second World War, the First World War veterans have been the guinea pigs for that whole process, really. And, there are huge improvements, both in terms of the durability, the weight of the prosthetic as well. And things like plastic surgery are a whole different discussion, but obviously, you know, the improvements that come as a result of the First World War in plastic surgery are huge as well. But I'm sorry, I don't know if that's you know, answers your question to some degree. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, the very pioneering spirit that comes through in relation to that.
Okay, splendid. Thanks very much indeed for that full answer there, Martin. David Crouch next. David, do you wish to unmute yourself there? David, you're now live.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
It's a question. At the beginning, you mentioned about assessment for war pensions based on physical injuries. And I was just wanted to get your thoughts on for soldiers who had non-visible injuries, so gas victims. So obviously, if they were significantly gassed, they would look, my great-grandfather, for example, they would spend a life of misery and pain, often with long-term lung injuries. For example, my great-grandfather didn't die while 1972, but spent most of his life as an invalid. So I just welcome your thoughts on kind of the assessment process for non-visible injuries.
I've got a very similar situation in my own family, actually. I had a great great uncle, actually, who was gassed, and he could only work in the summer months. As soon as the weather started to turn, he was incapable of working because of his breathing difficulties. What's interesting about this is that I think that one of the big problems that those sort of men faced was, you might have noticed at the start of the talk that there was a picture, that there was a cartoon that was part of the Westfield imagery of a man, a leg amputee on crutches. And I think that, sadly, they used that image quite cynically, because there was far more sympathy from people who obviously had a visible injury than there was to people who didn't. And so it's the old silver war badge, isn't it, that's nowhere near big enough to show anybody that, you know, that you've actually been injured in conflict. They weren't neglected, actually, by the system. So there were sort of quite a few Red Cross facilities set up during the war. And indeed, I spoke about the sister settlement of Westfield, which is Preston Hall in Kent. Now, that was a sort of wealthy family residence that had been handed over to the Red Cross during the war. And because it was out in the countryside, it was given over for men and their families who had suffered respiratory injuries. So men who'd been gassed, men who were suffering from TB, which of course was rife in the trenches. And they were put into these sort of agricultural fresh air treatment communities if they wanted to go there. And indeed, Mawson and Lushington Story, if they'd have got the funding from the government, they had plans for a second Lancashire settlement up on the coast at Meathop, which is over towards the Lake District, which was going to be a forestry sort of factory that was away from cities, away from noise, and in the countryside. And that would be for men suffering from what we would have described as shell shock. So men who might not have been sort of able to cope with working on an industrial settlement in a more urban type of environment. So they were aware of the kind of challenges and the practicalities of dealing with those sort of men. And there was sort of, you know, there was, you know, they were paid through the disability system. I think the biggest problem that those men faced was really the fact of how, as we've touched on, the wider society as a whole responded to them, because they weren't there missing an arm or missing a leg or wearing an eye patch or with some sort of really visible injury. But they were not recognised in the same way. just very briefly, there was a horrible incident that I came across on the Westfield settlement of a gentleman who came on who had, a very severe depression, a mental sort of issues in relation to his war service, and the secretary of the Westfield Committee, who was a former sort of commissioned officers, got him a job in the local asylum as a way to show him that there were people in a far worse state than he should, and he should buck up his ideas, which is horrendous, really. But I don't think, obviously there was some of that in that generation more so than now, but there was also that understanding. There were definitely people in Westfield who were there, as well as the people with sort of physical injuries who we know were there with psychiatric injuries as well.
Thanks for that. Yep, brilliant. Thanks for your question, David. Becca Bernstein. Hello, Becca. You're now live.
Much. I very much enjoyed your talk, Martin. I was wondering about disabled soldiers from other parts of the British Empire. So say you were Indian or African and you fought on behalf of Britain and you became disabled. Did these soldiers receive any kind of benefits, or what happened to them, once they went back to their countries?
Well, it varied from, country to country. I mean, it was very much to their nation state to deal with it. Britain sort of kind of said, well, we're going to look after our own, you look after your own. So it was a very variable state of affairs. I mean, I couldn't tell you in honesty. I wouldn't be confident in trying to give you a definitive answer about some of the Commonwealth countries. I know that Mawson toured. Well, he didn't tour. I know that he was in communication with them, certainly in Australia and New Zealand, and that we have reason to believe that certain communities that were set up there were directly influenced by his sort of blueprint, that book that I showed you, An Imperial Obligation. But I'm not aware of anything being set up in India, etc. And I wouldn't be confident in saying that. What I do know is that the idea that I think I mentioned in brief, that the British approach to this idea of a percentage based on your actual sort of physical injury, rather than it being tied in any way to your sort of ability to pick up where you left off, so to speak, before the war started, which was a different approach to most other allied nations, and indeed certainly to the Axis nations. One thing that I didn't mention, which is a whole different talk in itself, and there's a fabulous book by Deborah Cohen about it, is the different way that Germany treated its veterans to Britain. And in actual fact, the German veterans, disabled veterans, were treated far, far better, and yet they were far more sort of politically bolshy and problematic than the British veterans were. And she argues, I think very convincingly, that it's this idea that because the British veterans were so dependent on charity rather than the state, they were sort of worried about being seen as being sort of ungrateful and of biting the hand that feeds, and as such were nowhere near as sort of filled with revolutionary zeal as the German veterans were, who were actually being treated better because they were being treated directly by the state, and as such felt that they were within their rights to kind of take on the machine. So I'm sorry, I realise that isn't the complete answer you might have hoped for, but I mean, Britain is really my sort of speciality.
That's okay. It was very informative. Thank you.
Thanks, Becca, for your question there. Andrew asked this. I recall several family members who had been gassed during the First World War and who shared an increased degree of disability by the 1950s. As these men became infirm from their war service, were were they able to have their government pensions re-evaluated? How difficult was the process to have government pensions re-evaluated? That's Andrew's question.
Yeah, good, and it's a good question as well. Very difficult is the answer to that. In fact, in a lot of cases, as the years went by, the state was more inclined to try and reduce your pension than actually increase it. I mean, this is that issue again. I keep going back to Galsworthy and the sacred work, because this was he was the chief advisor to the Ministry of Pensions, and he was basically saying just this, that as people get older, their need is actually probably in a lot of cases going to grow. They're going to need more support, and obviously, as you can see it from the political point of view as well, the idea that you're going to sign up to actually increasing as the years go by rather than decreasing your commitment is not not going to be one that's going to go down well with the treasury.
Okay, thanks, Martin. You've just slightly buffered there, so we've just got a bit of screen freeze on Martin there. Pat Adamson, just while Martin gets his internet back. It's still not come back as Martin's internet. Pat, do you just want to ask you a question, and hopefully Martin's internet will have recovered by the time you ask your question.
Hello.
Hello, Pat.
A lot of the people you mentioned were Quakers. Was Mawson a Quaker, and were the majority of the people that set up these villages, or is it just a coincidence?
It's a very good question. Unfortunately, Martin's just disappeared. I'm hoping he'll come back in a moment. His screen froze, and now we have entirely lost Martin, I'm afraid. So let's just give it a moment or two just to see if he can rejoin us. And if he can't, I'll probably call that it. So just bear with us a second. Thanks for your question. Thanks for everybody's questions this evening. Okay. Okay, everybody. Apologies. We're going to have to probably call that it right now for this evening. That's the first time we've had such a webinars. It was always going to happen at one stage, and unfortunately, Martin's connection has just has obviously let him down. So, on behalf of everybody, in Martin's absence, can I just say thank you very much to Martin Purdy for his excellent talk, and we will reconvene again next week for another Western Front Association webinar. Apologies to everybody for the inability to finish the questions off, but thanks for joining us this evening. Thanks and good night.